This is Under the Influence, a show about coercive control. Please be aware that this show covers subjects some may find distressing.
Hello, my name is Joe and you are listening to Under the Influence. This time we are joined by Lloyd Evans, former Jehovah's Witness and now Jehovah's Witness activist, or so I should say anti-Jehovah's Witness activist. Welcome.
Thanks for having me on, Joe. I appreciate you inviting me.
Thank you very much for being here. So if we start off, I guess, at the beginning, my understanding is that you were born into the Jehovah's Witnesses.
Correct, yes.
So what was it like growing up in that?
It was obviously, I mean, I don't resent my childhood too much. I think my parents were mostly doing the best they could with the cards they had. They were obviously firm believers, and they believed that it was the best thing to raise me with their beliefs. I think that's how it is in most religions. In fact, I think that's how religion kind of gets so much of a foothold in society. But yeah, my childhood was very much immersed in the Jehovah's Witness religion, and I distinctly remember going to school expecting Armageddon any moment.
My understanding is that there's a fear of Armageddon, that, as you say, it's coming any moment. What do you think that does to a child's developing brain?
I think, well, obviously I'm not a psychologist, so although probably not enough psychologists study this, to be fair. But I can't imagine it having a healthy influence, because obviously you're going to school and you're not really fully able to integrate, because you believe that all of your classmates, not only will they die very soon, but they also deserve to die very soon, simply for the crime of not having your beliefs. I can't imagine that has a net positive in terms of a child's development and its ability to integrate with the world around it and with his or her or their classmates.
I guess, how did that affect you, for instance, making friends at school? And I understand you weren't allowed to celebrate birthdays, is that correct as well?
That's true, yes. I didn't really manage to make friends all that well at school. It didn't really help that I took the religion so seriously that I was using opportunities to preach to my classmates, which actually is what you're trained to do as a young Jehovah's Witness.
I was going to say, is that expected?
The way they put it to you is that school is your territory. So, the congregation or the rest of the congregation don't have access to your school for obvious reasons, but you do. So you should use the fact that you can get in there to preach to your classmates, to the teachers, to anyone. So as a young Jehovah's Witness, you're not going to school just to learn, you're going there also to preach. And so my efforts to preach to my classmates obviously only made me more conspicuous and more different, and made it very, very hard for me to make friends. So I actually, was bullied an awful lot in school as well for my religion.
That says a lot about your mindset at the time, that you felt that was something that you should do. And it's quite insidious, I guess.
It is, and it's just not. Children should go to school to learn. And they shouldn't feel like they have any duty whatsoever other than to just simply absorb knowledge. And particularly in areas such as evolution, for example, children of Jehovah's Witnesses feel that it's not just their duty to preach, but also they know better than the teachers, than the scientists, Their teacher may be telling them, and I can distinctly remember my teacher teaching me evolution for the first time. And I came home and I was having my dinner, and my parents were saying as I was eating, so what did you learn at school today? And so I said, well, we learned that that fish once walked out of the sea and became dinosaurs. And that was how my mind had understood it. But they were obviously horrified to learn that their son had just been taught something approximating evolutionary theory. And they actually complained to the school. And I can remember them actually going into the school to speak to the teacher because of how annoyed they were. So, yeah.
And how did that go, if you don't mind me asking?
I mean, I wasn't in the conversation when they went to the school, but I can only imagine it being. I mean, I would have loved to have been a fly on the wall, or even have a recording of what took place.
Me too.
But yeah, that's the sort of situation we're in, really. I think not just with Jehovah's Witnesses, but with lots of fundamentalist groups where it doesn't really mesh well with the education system, and so many children are forced really to have their education questioned.
Yeah. So speaking of children and schooling with the Jehovah's Witnesses, I on my way to my local train station, which I won't name which one for privacy reasons, I quite often see them out there with their cart full of books. I guess for our listeners who haven't seen them, it's a cart full of books and leaflets and pamphlets and those sort of things, and they try and stop you and talk to you. I quite frequently see a child with them, and this is during school hours, and I'm wondering, do some of them homeschool? Is that normal? Is that legal? How does that work? What's the...
Amazingly, it is legal, or at least it was when I was a Jehovah's Witness. I can even remember sort of as I'm going to say 29-year-old. I think I was an elder at the time, and I can remember going along to the meeting for field service, because whenever they do preaching, they have like a little meeting first, and they assign who's going to work with who. And I can remember dreading having to be assigned with, there was this girl who was obviously a minor and who was being homeschooled, and yet her mother, who was supposed to be educating her, was bringing her along to do preaching during school hours. And I can remember even on one occasion being mortified when I was with this girl going around people's homes, and someone pointed out, what on earth is this girl doing on my doorstep? She should be in school. And I wasn't even her parent, and I was having to deal with that sort of question, which is a perfectly justifiable question. Yeah. So it's not like every Jehovah's Witness child is homeschooled. I wasn't homeschooled. My sister was briefly homeschooled towards the end of her education, but many Jehovah's Witness children are homeschooled, and it's not right, really, that they should that parents who have taken it upon themselves to educate them are using that time in any way, shape, or form to enlist their children as essentially unpaid child volunteers.
Yeah, interesting. Quite sad as well. So you mentioned there that you're an elder. That's something that's someone who's quite high up in the organization. Is that fair to say?
Yeah, well, on a congregation level, yes, okay. The elders are very much looked up to. Yeah.
So is an elder someone who runs a congregation?
So right? Congregations are typically you can't have a congregation unless there are at least 3 elders who can form a service committee. So each congregation will have between, well, it could be anything upwards from 3 elders. Sometimes you could have 15, 20 elders, but typically a congregation will have maybe between 7 and 12 elders.
Okay, and a congregation is what goes on in those halls, the kingdom halls.
So they arrange meetings twice a week, and they're also tasked with organising the preaching work in their particular territory.
So, given that you were obviously quite high up in your local organisation, I guess I have to ask, what brought you to leave the Jehovah's Witnesses, and what was that process like for you?
What brought me to leave was that I moved to Croatia, and just moving to a different country with my then wife was a very disorienting experience, because I was attending meetings in a language that wasn't mine, and whereas before I'd been going to meetings twice a week and being barraged with kind of essentially indoctrination, telling me what to think and telling me who to be as an individual. Suddenly it was as though I was almost unplugged from this kind of constant barrage of indoctrination, and it just gave me the time and space to just take a step back and think, hang on a minute, do I really believe this? Because I'd already been having doubts since the age of maybe 19 or 20. And, these doubts kind of had a little bit of oxygen to just kind of come back to the surface and challenge me. But actually leaving Jehovah's Witnesses was a very arduous, long process. Actually, I must just slightly correct you on your introduction. You said I'm an anti-Jehovah's Witness activist.
Sorry.
I no, it's fine. I view myself as an ex-Jehovah's Witness activist, because I very much care about Jehovah's Witnesses on an individual basis, and it's the leadership really that I have an issue with. And so I was going through this kind of long process of having to challenge decades of indoctrination, and I guess the real kind of eureka moment was when one day I decided to not go to the meeting and stay home. I think I was ill, but I was sort of milking it a little bit as well. And I, in my own privacy and in my own space, I just sat down with a piece of paper and challenged myself to write a list of all the things that I didn't agree with as a Jehovah's Witness. And I ended up filling the page. There were actually 9 kind of main issues that I had an issue, a problem with, or where I disagreed with the organization or its teachings. And on finishing this piece of paper, I kind of immediately realized that I was no longer a Jehovah's Witness, because how could I be if I'd managed to fill a page with all of the ways in which I felt differently? And that was the main kind of point at which I thought, okay, I'm no longer a Jehovah's Witness, and now I need to find a way of kind of extricating myself as painlessly as possible from an organization that makes it very, very painful indeed to leave. Because Jehovah's Witnesses have shunning, where if you become a so-called apostate, you are to be ostracized by all of your believing family members. And here I was, with basically everyone that I knew, both my family and my friends, all of them believing and following this organization that I now was convinced was a lie. So
that's very interesting, that 2 particular threads that you mentioned there, which have come up in a lot of the interviews that I've done for this show. My colleague Kai has done for this show as well, which is the first one is disassociation, disconnection, different words, but same idea.
Yeah.
The other one is also an organization which makes it a long and arduous process to even leave, and quite often it's said that a sign of a cult is what happens when you try to leave, right?
Yeah.
And another thread that's very interesting also was that you were saying about how you still held on to some of the beliefs, but it was the organization that you initially had an issue with. And again, that's something that's come up quite a few people. I guess for our listeners, the organization at the very top consists of a group of, is it 12 men? Only men, never women.
Gosh, it's currently nine.
Okay.
9 men who formed the governing body. At one point, it was 10, but one of them bizarrely has stood down, which
we'll
was
get to
kind
that.
of very unexpected. But there's 9 members of the governing body at the moment,
okay.
and they are based in the town of Warwick in upstate New York, and they very much decide on everything that's kind of believed and practiced by Jehovah's Witnesses.
And am I right in thinking women are not allowed to do that job?
Well, no, women are excluded not just from that job, but many jobs. So you're not allowed to be an elder if you're a woman. Okay. You're not allowed to teach from the platform if you're a woman. Women are entrusted with preaching and with maybe raising their hand to comment at meetings, or they might be allowed to get on the platform if it's under the direction of a man who's giving a talk, if they're to share an experience or share an example of how to do the preaching work. They're also allowed to clean the Kingdom Hall facilities.
Right.
But no, there's no real role of authority that a woman can aspire to in the Jehovah's Witness organization.
So I had
chauvinistic.
an inkling that it was quite patriarchal and sexist, but
yeah.
So you mentioned about this person who has stopped being part of the governing body, it's called, isn't it?
Yeah.
Anthony Morris? Yes.
Correct, yeah.
Yeah. Can you tell us about Bottlegate?
Yeah, so it was, I think it was March 31st, 2019. And I'm remembering the date because I managed to get the video out on April 1st. I got it out as quickly as I could. And because it was an April 1st video, people assumed it was some kind of prank. But someone contacted me and said, I've just been in a liquor store and I saw Anthony Morris there. And not only that, but I also filmed him and had filmed a brief conversation with him. Do you want to see the video? And I was kind of falling over myself to see the footage, because although it seems like quite an innocuous thing, for you or I, to go to a liquor store, it's nothing really that extraordinary. But you have to bear in mind that this is an organization that teaches that if you have an alcohol problem, you ought to be disfellowshipped. So here's the leader of an organization that's very much anti-alcoholism in its teachings. And not only is he in a liquor store, but he's also buying a large quantity of very expensive single malt. Actually, it was Macallan's single malt, which, I think it was like $100 or thereabouts a bottle. And he's also in the business of persuading children to part with their money. There's 2 cartoons, in fact, Caleb and Sophia cartoons, reminding children of the need to set aside money for the organization, one of which encourages children to go without ice cream, give their ice cream money to the organization. And here's this individual who's wanting children to give up their ice cream money for the organization, splashing out on very expensive single malts. And so it was very, very, I would say, incriminating footage from that point of view. It also kind of just showed just how human these individuals are, because he rather awkwardly kind of was trying to get into a conversation with the guy who was filming him, and you almost sensed that he was trying to find an opportunity to preach, and then sort of realized that this was entirely the last if he was going to be telling the story of his successful conversion of this individual, this was not how he wanted to be said to be introducing himself in a liquor store. But anyway, I obviously made a video about it and showed the footage, and it basically it ended up being one of my most popular videos on my channel. And I think one of the main things really is that it helps people to understand that here's someone who is saying one thing and doing another, and it kind of also explained why this particular governing body member slurs his speech so much when he's giving talks. Because if you kind of follow the Jehovah's Witness video material that just gets churned out constantly by the group, pretty much any of his talks where he appears, he's slurring very badly and speaking quite incoherently at times. And it just kind of helped to explain perhaps why that might be. So, yeah.
So I was just going to ask, so do Jehovah's Witnesses drink alcohol at all, or?
They are allowed to drink alcohol, unlike the LDS church missionaries. In fact, I think it might be outright forbidden for all LDS members. I can't quite remember, but they are allowed to drink alcohol, but only in moderation. And if you're found to have an alcohol problem, if you're found to be drinking alcohol too much, then you can be disfellowshipped and thrown out and shunned. So he has been. It was just, there was a very brief kind of terse announcement on the jw.org website a couple of months back, just saying that Anthony Morris III is no longer a member of the governing body, and no explanation given. So we can't know for sure why it was that he was removed, but I'm almost sad in a way, because I quite enjoyed making rebuttals to his kind of incoherent ramblings, and in a way, I'm almost mourning the fact that the organization is starting to develop a little bit of self-awareness, because one of the most kind of pleasurable parts of doing my job is just how deluded the leadership are, and the fact that, for example, they could go for years after 2019 with this individual who was very, very clearly struggling with an alcohol dependency, and allowing him to give talks and just make an idiot of himself on camera, and just basically making my job much, much easier. And it's almost chilling in a way that the organization might now be developing a bit of a sense of self-awareness and realizing that people do scrutinize these things, and people do ask questions of the leaders and hold them to the standards that the leaders are advocating.
Interesting. So we've spoken a bit about the kind of sexism of the organisation. I understand they're also virulently homophobic. I've seen some things of Stephen Lett particularly. Yeah. Saying some, I guess, slurs, which I won't repeat, but... Yeah.
Yeah, it's baked into the organisation, unfortunately. And I think the sad part is that this is not something that's exclusive to Jehovah's Witnesses by any means. I mean, we're really talking about a problem throughout fundamentalist Christianity that stems from the fact that you have verses in, for example, I think it's Leviticus 20 verse 13 that calls for gay people to be executed. It's difficult. I realize that many who profess to be Christians are able to kind of square the circle, but it's difficult, I would suggest, when it's right there in quote unquote God's word, that gay people are to be vilified and viewed as some kind of abomination. And so because Jehovah's Witnesses are effectively Bible literalists and fundamentalists and assume every word of the Bible to have profound meaning, they really do look down on gay people, and they've produced, especially over the last in recent years, they've produced video after video, including a children's video, encouraging this kind of homophobic, hateful narrative, and it pops up in talk after talk, including I can think of one or two talks by Tony Morris before he was ejected. But yes, you're right. Stephen Lett infamously gave a talk at, I think it was the 2020 convention, where he postulated about a gay person being resurrected into paradise in the future, and explained how they would have to stop being gay, or else if they continued to be gay, they would be allowed a brief period of time to kind of get their act together and de-gay themselves in some way. And he even came up with some weird biblical reasoning to suggest that they would maybe be allowed up to 100 years, which was actually news to me at the time. I hadn't even considered the possibility that there might be any form of gay community in the paradise where everyone's kind of on a 100-year limit, that's 100 years of partying, isn't it? Which I guess is better than nothing. And that would be the fun place in paradise, I would suggest. That would be the place to be. But in all seriousness, it was very, very dehumanizing and hateful wording that I can only imagine it if you were an LGBTQ plus person and you were watching this, particularly as a younger person, and you have your parents sat either side of you. It would have been an excruciating experience to sit through that particular talk, which we've since found out was given off the back of Stephen Lett's nephew committing suicide because he was gay. And I know this because I've interviewed Stephen Lett's niece, and she's explained the backstory to it all. So he gave this talk at the convention, with this very kind of personal link to the issue, and yet still doubled down on the homophobic, hateful narrative.
That's really quite sad and quite telling, isn't it? So I guess on another serious note as well, can you tell us about the Australian Royal Commission?
Sure. So Jehovah's Witnesses have an epidemic of child sexual abuse. They're obviously not the only religious group that has this problem, but I would suggest it's kind of conspicuous in Jehovah's Witnesses due to the scale of what's happening and the very highly organized way in which they hoard information on abusers and take it upon themselves to override the legal system and make their own determinations on how sexual predators ought to be dealt with and whether they ought to be dealt with at all. So the Australian Royal Commission took place back in, I'm going to say, it took place over a number of years, but for Jehovah's Witnesses, it came to a head in sort of 2014, 2015, when they did their investigation on Jehovah's Witnesses and took testimony from a number of senior Jehovah's Witnesses, including one governing body member. And the most damning part of the evidence was the disclosure that out of 1,006 records out of 1,006 pedophiles that the organization in Australia alone had been keeping records on, not a single one had been reported to the authorities. So, and that was just in Australia. So I've since kind of used that figure of 1,006, and I think it was 1,800 victims that these 1,006 predators had accumulated among them, going back to the year 1950. And because I have a very extensive collection of Watchtower yearbooks that give all the member figures going back that far, I've done extrapolations for I think Canada, America, and the UK. And in the UK, it's over. If we were to use the same data, it would be I think, over 2,000 predators for the same period. But unfortunately, in the UK, there is far less urgency by the government to intervene. And recently, there was a huge missed opportunity with the ICSA inquiry, the Independent Inquiry into Child Sexual Abuse. I was a core participant for that inquiry, and I and others were imploring the inquiry to do what they did in Australia and get the data on how many predators there were and how many victims they had amassed between them. And the inquiry flatly refused to do it. So, hats off to Australia for actually doing their job and making it so that we can actually understand something about the extent of the problem with child abuse among Jehovah's Witnesses.
Yeah, that's really pretty damning statistics there, I think it's fair to say, and obviously a huge tragedy for all the victims that these people are allowed to continue doing what they're doing. I guess on that sad note, we're kind of running out of time here, but thank you very much for joining us.
No, it's an absolute pleasure, and thank you for giving your attention to this. It's been a real pleasure speaking to you.
Cool, thank you.